Mr. Harryhausen, my questions are about your monsters in your films.
We don't call them monsters, we call them creatures.
Your creatures.
Yeah.
I'd like to know if you were attached to the creatures in your films.
Do we?
If you were attached to the creatures in your films.
Attached?
Attached to them personally.
Well, you have to give them a personality, so in one sense you have to be attached to them. We try to make them believable creatures. We try to get sympathy for them, particularly if they're humanoid in form. But mythology and legends all have rather strange creatures that some people call monsters. But I think they all have a symbolism in the long run that goes way back into ancient Greek mythology.
Well, given the sympathy that you try to elicit for your creatures, how do you feel that they're always destroyed in your films, and that the first reaction to the creatures is to destroy them?
Well, we don't like to destroy them, really. Some of them we don't. But usually it's for dramatic sake. There's no drama if you don't have some kind of synthetic violence. And all the fairy tales of the past are quite violent. Little Red Riding Hood is very lascivious, the original story, as well as violent. And Hans Christian Andersen and some of the Grimm's fairy tales are quite violent. But there's a big difference between realistic violence or pseudo-realistic violence and mythical violence, I think. And I think people are aware of that. If you have to have a certain amount of violence to create a climax in a picture. And unfortunately, if you have a hero in your picture, you've got to let him win rather than the creature.
Well, what do you think of modern cinema creatures?
Well, some of them are so extreme. Modern cinema creatures are somewhat extreme today. We tried to make ours logical up to a point that you can in fantasy. But when they get too extreme, I think you lose your audience because they are used to seeing certain things, and the human form, the humanoid form, is of course the most functional form that there can be. So we try to make, for example, the gorilla in Mighty Joe Young, that has a humanoid form. The emir has a somewhat humanoid form. And it's much easier to get sympathy for them and give them character than it is for a four-legged animal or even a Tyrannosaurus.
What creatures would you like to work with?
Well, all the mythological creatures. I remember when I grew up in the early days of cinema, there was a lady called Maria Montez who used to make Arabian. You're too young to remember them, I think. But she made with Sabu and John Hall these Arabian Night pictures. And they would talk about these creatures of the Arabian Nights, and that you never saw them on the screen. They were always off screen. And that annoyed me enormously when I was growing up. So I was bound and determined when I got into filmmaking to put these from the creature's point of view on the screen. And the same applies to mythology. The early Italian missile man pictures always talked about the Cyclops or the flying horse, but you seldom ever saw it on the screen. And when you did see it, you usually saw a muscle-bound man riding a horse with wings about 3 feet long, which was, illogical, completely illogical. So, of course, mythology, you have to take license with it because there's no real strong basic logic in mythology. But we have to try to inject a certain amount of it in order to hold an audience.
One last question. What would you do if I told you there was a creature loose in the city right now?
Well, I would say you've got a great imagination. But again, this is a what-if. Fantasy, after all, science fiction and fantasy and mythology is what if. That's the whole point of these type of rather outrageous stories. So they all tend to stretch the imagination. So I think they're very viable. Greek mythology has a great deal to it, more than meets the eye. And we tried to inject that type of interpretation into our Greek mythology pictures. And we even resorted to science fiction with the Earth versus the flying saucers. And I worked very closely with Kurt Siodmak on the original script when we formulated the story. And I even brought to his attention that these creatures' uniforms were made out of solidified electricity. Now, obviously, solidified electricity is of the imagination, but it sounds good and technically sound for an alien. But we tried to make the saucers give the impression that an intelligence was guiding them. And we showed only, I think, one scene where we actually showed the creature itself.
Thank you, sir.